We all make mistakes. Yes, I said it. We all make mistakes. It's something we all do. It's something we all regret at the time, but it's something we all learn from. You had that spicy taco last night. Well, you're going to learn from the mistake that you made because you're in for a rough day today, my friend. If you drank too much alcohol last night, same thing. You're going to regret it. You're probably not going to learn from it. You're probably going to pretend that you learned from it for about 2 days, and then you're going to go right back to it because you didn't learn from your mistake. The point is, people, we have to learn from our mistakes, and some people do, some people don't. And we're going to be going through a list of the 20th century prime ministers of the United Kingdom and their single biggest mistake. Now, I know that this is subjective perhaps, but not necessarily, because this is a mistake widely regarded as being a mistake by either the politicians of the time, the people of the time, historians today, and so forth. So without further ado, here are, in order, the 20th century UK prime ministers and their single biggest mistake. Quick disclaimer here, folks. We are leaving it to the 20th century prime ministers simply because, quite simply, it's going to lead into a political debate and political argument if I include some of the more modern contemporary prime ministers. And there have been many in recent years, that's for sure. And whereas I am always up for a political debate with you, this is not the place to do it. So we're going to be limiting it to, we'll include Gordon Brown too, because he's kind of a 20th century prime minister, even though he technically isn't. Though Robert Gascoigne Cecil was technically the first prime minister of the 20th century, given that his premiership ended in 1902, we're going to only include prime ministers who were elected in the 20th century. So we're going to start with our good friend Arthur Balfour, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1902 and 1905. Arthur Balfour's single biggest political mistake is often viewed as being the Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917, and this declaration expressed British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And as you know, Israel and Palestine is consistently and constantly in the news lately, and the Balfour Declaration played a major part in the tensions there. So there was the promises to two different groups. One major criticism of the Balfour Declaration is the promise of the same land to both the Jewish and Arab populations in Palestine. And this dual commitment set the stage for tensions and conflicts between the two communities, which are still warring today. Critics also argued that the declaration, by expressing support for a national home for the Jewish people, did not adequately consider the rights and aspirations of the indigenous Arab population in Palestine, and this disregard for the Arab perspective contributed to long-standing conflicts in the region. And the long-term impact of the Balfour Declaration is obviously evident in the ongoing Israeli-Palestine conflict. The issues surrounding borders, refugees, and the status of Jerusalem are rooted in part in the historical events and decisions that followed the declaration. So I guess this would be Balfour's worst mistake. I mean, I'm sure there were good intentions, maybe, but it's hard to agree with that. Anyway, up next, we have Henry Campbell Bannerman, and a prime minister that history often forgets, but one who is potentially one of the better ones. He was a radical. He was prime minister between 1905 till 1908 when he resigned due to poor health. He died just 19 days later, and he's the only prime minister to die in the official residence, 10 Downing Street, as well as the last liberal prime minister of the United Kingdom. So what is his worst mistake? Well, I had to do some research for this one because I don't know an awful lot about him, but the more I read about him, the more I like. And it appears as though his biggest mistake was military reform. After failures in the Boer War and the rise of Imperial Germany as a major force within Europe, whose economy had surpassed even the British, there was a big demand for reform of the British Army and the British military, and the Escher report was released, and this made a few recommendations of change, which eventually resulted in cuts to defense spending. And this would be of great detriment to Britain and the United Kingdom during the First World War, which was only a few years later, less than a decade later, and it exposed many of the weakened capabilities of the British Empire to maintain its empire. And I guess this would probably be his biggest mistake, as this occurred during his premiership. It's not even entirely his fault. It was approved by the King, Edward VII, and recommended to him. So I would put this down as his biggest mistake. If anyone has any bigger suggestions, please leave a message in the comments so that I can read into it. Next, we have H.H. Asquith. Asquith was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1908 and 1916, and though he was originally a very popular Prime Minister, his tenure is marked by many mistakes. In fact, his is so far the most difficult premiership to sum up with one mistake, because there are so many, from the failure to address the issue of women's suffrage during his premiership, to the lack of a coalition government. He failed to unite Britain's politics during World War One, like in World War Two, where we had a coalition government. There was no such coalition government in World War One because of him. But I'm probably going to put his worst mistake as his handling of World War One. His management of World War One has been subject to much criticism, and some historians argue that he was slow to respond to the demands of war, and his administration faced challenges in terms of military strategy, munitions, production, and the overall coordination of war efforts. Britain's military capabilities had been downgraded to the point where they were not adequately prepared for the scale and intensity of what was a modern war. The British military faced shortages in essential equipment, and this unpreparedness contributed to difficulties on the Western Front, certainly within the early years of the war. And the management of the military strategy and coordination faced challenges under his leadership. There were issues with the overall planning and execution of military campaigns, including the Dardanelles campaign, or Gallipoli, in 1915, which ended in failure and heavy casualties. So this would probably be his biggest mistake. His handling of World War One is often criticized most by historians, and rightfully so, because it's the one which led to the most deaths, and it led to his resignation, which again was terrible considering he was leaving during the middle of World War One. And yeah, he's just a failure, ladies and gentlemen. David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1916 and 1922. He was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during some of its most turbulent times during the First World War, and he has some notable achievements, notably his First World War leadership, the People's Budget of 1909, the National Insurance Act of 1911, land reforms, Representation of the People Act of 1918, the Versailles Treaty negotiations. But in some ways, David Lloyd George has become an infamous figure in British history and is considered by some as being something of a traitor, mostly because he became a friend and perhaps ally of Adolf Hitler. Yes, the first few prime ministers on this list are going to have their worst mistake as being something to do with Hitler. It's just inevitable. In 1936, David Lloyd George wrote an article titled "I Talk to Hitler" in the Daily Express newspaper, and it says some rather questionable things. This is a reading from Lloyd George himself, of course. This is not me impersonating him. "I have now seen the famous German leader and also something of the great change he has effected. Whatever one may think of his methods, and they are certainly not those of a parliamentary country, there can be no doubt that he has achieved a marvellous transformation in the spirit of the people, in their attitude towards each other, and in their social and economic outlook. There is for the first time since the war a general sense of security. The people are more cheerful. There is a greater sense of general gaiety of spirits throughout the land. It is a happier Germany. I saw it everywhere, and Englishmen I met during my trip and who knew Germany well were very impressed with the change. As to his popularity, especially among the youth of Germany, there can be no manner of doubt. The old trust him, the young idolize him. It is not the admiration according to you get the point, people, okay? So he developed this rather weird affection with Adolf Hitler, and as people will know, there is Operation Sea Lion, which was Germany's attempt to conquer the island of Great Britain, and their plan was to install David Lloyd George as a puppet prime minister should they ever succeed with Operation Sea Lion. So in some ways, it's clear that David Lloyd George became not only a friend of Adolf Hitler, but an ally too, and this would probably be his biggest mistake. Yes, it didn't occur while he was prime minister, but it's something which will overshadow many of his achievements. Next, we have Stanley Baldwin, a man who was Prime Minister on 3 different occasions, from 1923 to 1924, 1924 to 1929, and 1935 to 1937. And though he is sometimes generally well regarded, there were some notable mistakes, and I deliberated over which one was probably his worst, from the Channel Crisis in 1922 to the beginning of the appeasement of Nazi Germany and Hitler, which didn't necessarily start with Neville Chamberlain. It did start with Stanley Baldwin in some ways. But I think I've narrowed it down to the worst being his general disregard of Spain during its war against Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War. Stanley Baldwin was more fearful of communism spreading throughout Europe, and for this reason he was less convinced by the socialists fighting within Spain and more favorable towards Francisco Franco, who was of course receiving support from the likes of Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany. And Stanley Baldwin's main concern was the rise of communism, and Stalin, who was on the side of the Spanish socialists to some extent, though not greatly as much as they would have liked. And Baldwin's reluctance to do anything about this is part of why Spain fell to the fascists, where it would remain for 30 plus years. So, yes, I'm going to put Stanley Baldwin's worst crime as being his neglect of Spain during the Spanish Civil War. Next, we have Ramsay MacDonald, who was the first ever Labour Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he was Prime Minister firstly between January 1924 and November 1924, and then again for a second time between 1929 and 1935. And there are many political mistakes that he made, and arguably his biggest political mistake was not one that was really a reflection of his government, but one which was seen as a traitorous move on his own personal account. He went into government with the Conservative Party and formed National Labour. This was seen as the ultimate betrayal by socialist workers at the time, as the Labour Party was founded in part by MacDonald, and it was founded to represent the labours of Britain. And of course, the Conservative Party was seen as the opposite of this, as it kind of still is today. And as a result, MacDonald is still seen as a traitor today and is sometimes largely forgotten by history. So this would probably be his biggest political mistake. Otherwise, his handling of the Depression was just as bad, if not worse. Next, we come to Neville Chamberlain, who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1937 and 1940. Poor Neville. We know what his greatest mistake is. It's well documented. If you went to school in the United Kingdom, you will know that his greatest mistake was the general appeasement of Nazi Germany, which was also called the policy of appeasement. So, the policy of appeasement emerged in the context of the harsh terms imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, another mistake by David Lloyd George, by the way, after World War I. Many British leaders, including Chamberlain, believed that addressing Germany's grievances and avoiding another war were crucial for European stability, and Germany under Adolf Hitler sought to overturn what it perceived as unjust provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, including territorial losses and military restrictions. So Chamberlain, along with other Western leaders, was sympathetic to much of these grievances, and despite Chamberlain's efforts, appeasement ultimately failed to prevent war. Hitler's ambitions extended beyond the concessions granted in Munich, and in 1939 Germany invaded Poland, leading to the outbreak of World War II. The failure of appeasement is often criticized for emboldening Hitler and allowing the German military machine to grow stronger, while Chamberlain had to resign basically from the sheer shame of allowing this to happen, and history remembers him as being someone rather cowardly who allowed Nazi Germany to progress to the point where it was close to conquering much of Europe and the wider world. Chamberlain's believing that Hitler should not be confronted militarily but rather negotiated with, it didn't go well, and Hitler took advantage of it. Next, we have Winston Churchill. But when I say next, I mean in the next episode, because we're going to end here as this video is going on far too long already. So part 2 will be out on Wednesday, and we will begin by looking at Winston Churchill's biggest failure. Can you guess what it is? Would you like to give me some idea on what you think it should be? Let me know in the comments section below, and you can follow us in the meantime on facebook.com/The Collective Histories page, and on Instagram at instagram.com/The Collective Histories, and on X/Twitter at twitter.com/Collective Histo. You can also buy me a coffee. You can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Collective Histories. And then, if that's not enough, you should hit the subscribe button one more time. Make sure you are definitely subscribed, and then we will all be happy. I'll be happy, you'll be happy, and you'll get your content. Okay, have a good day. Goodbye.